All right, here we are again. So we got a lot to do today. And so we'll start by going over the chapter 6 problem set. And then we're ready for chapter 7, which is our introduction to inflation. Now, it just so happens that I was able to find quite a few very interesting videos about inflation. And so we'll be looking at these as we go along. But yes, go ahead, Bailey.
I just have a question. Is
Yes.
there going to be any midterm soon or like
Oh,
exam
yes.
coming up?
Well, here's what we're going to do. On Friday, rather, we're going to go over the so-called sample midterm, which is a review of everything from the first 4 chapters. And then when that's done, I'm going to post the actual midterm online on Moodle. In fact, well, it's not here yet, but it will be. Hold on one second. And then what you're going to do is download it, and then you will work on it at home. And you'll be able to send me either, if you have a scanner, you can send PDF copies of it back to me. There is an app of some kind, or at least one app that you can get for your iPhone that lets you scan documents. One of them is called, I think, Genius Scan, which I have, I believe, on my phone, only because somebody mentioned it to me and I didn't want to forget. I haven't used it because I'm, so far behind the technology 8 ball here. But let me just double check and see what I can find. Let's see. There it is. It is called Genius Scan. And people who have used it have told me that the quality is quite good and it's free. So I guess you just hold your phone up to the documents and it turns them into PDF files, which you then can email back to me. And if not, you can just use your camera. If you use the camera, though, be careful and make sure that there isn't glare all over the paper and that it's large enough that I can read it. Especially if you're writing in pencil, sometimes there can be a problem with glare in pencil. So just look at the documents before you send them to me and make sure you can read them yourself, and then you can fire them over here by email. The only consistent problem we have with this setup is that those pictures can get very large. And sometimes if you try to email very large pictures, it causes a lot of problems and they end up often not getting delivered. So what you should probably do is maybe take 1 picture per page and then send them to me, but not necessarily all in the same email. Like imagine if you've got 10 or 12 pictures, each has 1 page of your answers. You can send them to me like in small batches, just because if you try to do it all at once, it may end up not being delivered at all. So we'll discuss that further on Friday, but you're basically doing this at home and then you're electronically delivering the answers back to me. Okay, and so that will be the first midterm. It'll cover chapters 1 through 4, and it'll be very similar to the sample midterm that we'll be reviewing on Friday. In fact, let's go get the sample midterm so we can look at it and see exactly what's going on there. So if you look here, I've got it way down here somewhere. Here's the sample midterm. And let's open it up for a minute. And you'll say, oh, that's interesting. It looks just like the first 4 chapters, okay? So you have a group of what are called short answers or fill-in questions where you can answer them with, usually a few words or a sentence or so, sometimes a single number. So these are designed to make sure you really understand the concepts that we've been covering. And then the actual problems are down here and you recognize some of these. For example, this is a table you'll use to create a production possibilities frontier and calculate opportunity costs. And then down here, these all have something to do with supply and demand. Okay, now you're not required to draw graphs unless it actually asks for one. But the advantage of doing this with a phone and taking pictures is that you can draw pictures on a piece of paper by hand if you need to, and then those will be just fine. But again, like I said, you're going to eventually have to either scan everything or else take photographs of it and then email it back to me. Now, when you do that, by the way, here's one thing I want to ask you to do. I've been sending you invitations from my Gmail account only because it doesn't work well with purchases Gmail system for some reason. But when you do send your answers back to me, what I would like you to do is send them to my purchase account, because that way everything will be in one convenient location for me. In other words, I get a lot of emails in my Gmail account, and I mean a lot of them. And so if you send them to my purchase account, I don't have anything like the number of emails in there. And so it'll be much easier for me to find them. Okay, so in other words, here's my email account at purchase. And in case I think it's on the syllabus, but let me just open this up for you. And let's see what we're looking at here. All right, so this is my account. Okay. So the email address here is just my name, alan.anderson@purchase.edu. And so if you send it here, it makes it a lot harder for me to lose it. Okay, now you can see the inbox is not very full, and there's plenty of room here. So try to remember, and I'll remind you again on Friday to send it here rather than my Gmail account. If you do send it to the Gmail account, it's fine. But I'd prefer that you send it here, just because, like I said, it's easier to organize them all and find them all, because, like I said, with these large documents, you never know what might happen. Now, by the way, one more thing. If you own a printer in your house, there's a very real chance that it has a scanner built into it, which you may or may not have ever used. If that's the case, the scanner works very well. The physical scanner, I mean, it'll turn your document into a PDF file, and it can email it back to your hard drive, and then you can email it directly to me as well. So that option is always on the table. Now, if you live, let's say, because this is an online class and you live out in the middle of nowhere and you don't have access to any of these amazing devices, you can always mail them to me in the physical US mail, but just remember, it'll take a while to get here. Okay. I don't think anybody's ever asked for that option in the past, but it's always on the table. Okay, just in case you live in a cabin in the woods in upstate New York, where the closest internet router is 20 miles away. In that case, then you can mail it. But basically, you're going to want to email them back to me, and so you can either use your phone to take pictures, or else scan them with an app on your phone like Genius Scan, or else use a physical scanner on your printer. All right. Now, with all that being said, if you're really, really good with Word, you could type up your answers and email me the document directly. And some people have done this before. Type the answers in Word and just email it to me without having to take any pictures, and then only reserve the pictures for your graphs. All right. That's also a possibility. If you'd rather not do this all by hand, you can type it into a Word document. In fact, some people have actually been able to do the graphs in Word. It's not easy, but it can be done. So that's another possibility if you're interested in that. So but whatever it takes, you've got to get all that stuff delivered back to me so that I can grade it. So what most likely we'll finish that on Friday rather, and then I'll post the exam, and then I'll give you about a week or so to finish it. Now, it's not going to take a week. The exam itself was written for a physical class where you're in a classroom taking the exam with blue books. So it was meant to be something you could knock it off in an hour, hour and a half. So even though I'm giving you a week, don't panic and think that it's going to take a week. It's just because you might want to spend a lot of time working on it, and because you might have other exams as well. Okay, so that's why I'd rather just let you have a week and just take your time and get it done properly. But it isn't going to take that long. All right, so with all that being said, now we're ready to get started. Today, we have the Chapter 6 problem set, which is fairly quick. Here it is. No, that's not it. That's the sample midterm. Let me get the problem set open. And then we can start looking at our introduction to inflation. And then I want you to see at least a couple of these videos, because it's a very interesting area. You might not think so. Yes, Fernando.
Just a quick question about the midterms real quick.
Uh-huh.
So both sample midterm and when we get the actual midterm, they're both gonna be graded on based on what we learned, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the actual midterm will be extremely similar to the sample midterm because I mean, like, we only can cover so much material. So let's just put it this way. You'll not see anything on there that you don't recognize. Everything on the test will be something we covered in class and is in the slides. Okay, there's no obscure references, there's no outside readings, there's no surprises. I know that you may have run into that in the past in other classes, not here. Whatever we've been doing is what you're going to be questioned on. Okay. If you find a question that you're not sure about, go back and review your notes again, or your slides, or even, you can even watch the videos again. There's nothing in there that we haven't gone over. Let's put it that way.
All right, but it will both have its own different, like its own grade though, right? As
No,
well.
the sample midterm isn't being graded. It's just for practice. It's the only
Oh,
thing the midterm is being graded. The sample midterm, you should just work on it and have it ready for Friday so that you can see how well you did.
okay. All right, thank you.
That's all it is. It's just like, imagine it's like a dress rehearsal for a play. Everything's there except the audience. So it's just like, it's just a way for you to find out, do I understand this material or not? Okay, that's all it is. Oh, Diana says that she uses the Genius Scan all the time. Okay, that's good. So it does work. Excellent. I don't know how it works, but I'm sure you could all learn it very quickly. It's gotten to the point in this day and age where I actually do this myself. If I get a physical check in the mail, which I do occasionally, I can actually deposit it directly in my Chase account by taking a picture of it. It's unbelievable. And so I guess the scanning technology has improved dramatically over the last 10 years. So, all right. So just remember that. And it's free. Now, I'm not telling you have to have it, but it's the only one that I know about. Oh, for God's sakes, let's look for this thing. I'm sure you guys use the iTunes store all the time, or whatever they call it right now. They change this stuff much too fast for me to keep up with it. There it is. Genius Scan PDF scanner on the App Store. Rating 4.9. That's not bad. As far as I know, it's free. Oh God, hold on, everyone. I have to take this phone call. Excuse me for 1 second. This is Alan. Hi. How are you doing? I know. Well, you know what? That damn COVID or still nothing rest. I'm definitely playing. I actually one got COVID. So, I got one coming. Sure. All right. Let's see. Okay. See you then. All right, bye. Okay, sorry about that. But anyway, so here we go. So let's get back to the chapter 6 problem set. And let's see, where are we? So yes, so you have a lot of options for getting the material back to me. So, and we'll discuss it again on Friday. That sounds good. All right, so let's get back here. So the chapter 6 problem set, I think I just opened it. Let's see. And the chapter 6 problem set, remember, this is about unemployment. The inflation discussion is pretty interesting because it affects, of course, the value of our currency. And so we're going to learn how and why this happens. And what we're also going to do is look at some interesting historical cases where inflation really, really got out of hand. Okay, some really unbelievable situations that have arisen in history as a result of rapid inflation. But all right, no, not that one. All right, I guess I did not download it. Hold on. All right, here we go at long last. All right, let me save this. All right, so we have the US population at 300 million. The working age population is 200 million, of which 125 million are employed and 15 million are unemployed. Okay, so what about the labor force? Now, the labor force is defined as total employed plus total unemployed, which means in this case, 125 million plus 15 million equals 140 million. So that's how many people are available for work, basically. People who are currently working and people who are actively looking for a new job. Of the rest, now you notice the working age population is 200 million. The labor force is only 140 million. That means there's 60 million people who theoretically could work but are not available for different reasons. For example, being in college or being retired or being or having something else to do that prevents you from working. And now B, what is the unemployment rate? So remember, the unemployment rate equals unemployment or total unemployed over the labor force. So that's going to give us 15 million over 140 million. And that works out to be 0.107 or 10.7%. Now, the employment population ratio is defined as total employed. This is over the working age population, though. So I don't think this is as meaningful as the unemployment rate, but you know, some economists like this number. So the total employed is, as we saw before, 125 million, and the working age population is 200 million, which equals 0.625 or 62.5%. So in other words, of all the people who in principle could be working, about 62.5% are working. And then finally, the labor force participation rate equals size of the labor force divided by the working age population. In other words, of the entire working age population, what proportion are available for work? So we saw that in part A, the labor force is 140 million. and the working age population is 200 million. So that means in this case, it's 70%, right? So all the people who theoretically could work, 70% are either working or looking for work. The other 30% are busy with other activities. Like I said, being retired, being a student, staying home with the kids, all those are reasons why you might not be available for work. Okay. So 70 in the real world, the number's a little lower than that, but not that much. Okay, now 2A. According to BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics keeps track of all this information about unemployment and many other things too, for that matter. In order to be unemployed, there's really 3 requirements, but I mean, well, it's only asking for 1, but let's write them all down. Does not have a job. That's probably the number 1 thing. Number 2, has actively looked for work. If you're not working, that is, has actively looked for work during the past 4 weeks. Now, sometimes people who already have jobs do this too, but they're already working, so they're definitely not being counted as unemployed. But they're talking about here about people who are not working and are actively looking for work. And then finally, another thing that is really necessary is that you must be available. In other words, if they call a job and said, let's say you filed for unemployment insurance with the state that you live in, and one day they called you up and said, listen, we got this opening. You have to be in a position to take it. You don't have to take it, but you do have to be available. Theoretically, if it was a job you wanted or liked, you could say yes. There's nothing to stop you from showing up for that job. All right, part B. Now, the surprising thing here, the minimum age considered to be part of the working age population is not 18, but 16. So I think that that's because theoretically you could drop out of high school at 16 if you felt so inclined and start working. Now, of course, by far, the majority of people don't do that. Unless, you never know. Like if you've got some very specialized skill, like you hear about these people who go on to become famous musicians or artists, and they dropped out. They couldn't bother. I think, I can't think of any examples offhand. Some very famous people dropped out of college, like Bill Gates never finished at Harvard because he was too busy with Microsoft. But high school is a different matter. You drop out of high school, you're really closing a lot of doors. College is different. Not only is it not necessary for everything, but if you don't finish college right away, you can always go back to it later on. High school is a very different matter. So that's why very few people in the United States drop out at 16, even though they could in principle. All right. Now, how does the BLS define who's in the labor force? So technically, to be in the labor force, you just have to be working. People who have jobs, or those who are out of a job, but are available. That's one way you could write it. Just as long as the most important detail is that all these people in principle are available for work. Some of them have jobs, some of them do not, but they're all available for work. All right, very good. Now, retirees part of the labor force? No, that's the whole point of being retired. You're basically saying, that's it, I've had enough of this. I'm going to spend the rest of my life sipping pina coladas on the beach. Well, only if you had a very successful career. It really just means you're not working anymore. That's it. You reach a certain age and you say, I've had it. I don't want to do this anymore, and I can afford not to. And therefore, I'm going to enjoy the rest of my life. That's what you want. You want that to happen as young as possible. That's why you're going to work so hard for the rest of your life to reach that point where you can say, that's it. No more work. I'm going to be happy for the rest of my life. All right. Anyway, so here with these data, the working age population is 200 million. The labor force is 160 million. And there are 6 million unemployed people. The unemployment rate, remember, equals, let's go back up here. Let me just copy this definition up here. Just to make it clear. Total labor force, total unemployed over the total labor force. And so in this example, we have 6 million unemployed over 160 million. And that leaves us with 0.0375 or 3.75%. So in this economy, only 3.75% are considered to be unemployed. Now, labor force participation rate is labor force. Actually, we did this up here, didn't we? There it is. Oh, okay. Well, all right. So basically we can steal this from part one. Well, that worked out rather well. Okay. And if you want to turn a percentage, you can multiply it by 100. That's really not that important. Discouraged worker. Okay. Now, discouraged means this is someone who's not working, but would like to. But has not actively looked for work in 4 weeks, more than 4 weeks. Oh, but has actively looked for work within the last 12 months. I guess after that, if you haven't looked for work in more than 12 months, they figure there's some reason why you're not serious about looking for work then. Okay, maybe you build a cabin in the woods and you're living out there or something. That's just too far ahead. So you're not actively considered to be, you're not unemployed because you haven't looked for work in 4 weeks, but you're not actually completely out of, you're not completely discouraged either. In other words, you're not happy with the job market. You're taking your time. You're technically, you're kind of still working or looking for work, but you're not being very aggressive about it. So that's the cutoff point as far as they're concerned. You're looking for somebody who hasn't looked for work in 4 weeks, but they have tried to get a job in the last year. Now, those are the people who get counted in some of the higher U's, not U3, the official measure, but some of the higher ones like 4, 5, and 6 may include discouraged workers. And of course, obviously, the number of discouraged workers goes up when there's a recession, because what starts happening is people who have, let's say, marginal skills, who would have trouble finding a job even in the best of times, find it almost impossible to find work when the economy is slowing down. So does the BLS consider marginally attached workers to be part of the labor force? Well, the answer is no. No, because they're, that's the way they define it, the labor force. It's the labor force only includes people who are working or actively looking for work, and marginally attached workers are not actively seeking work. Okay, now of all the U's that we saw, U3 is the official unemployment rate. There's a 6, but the 3 is the one that you see the most often. It's the one that you hear about in the media. It's the one that you hear about when policymakers are talking about the unemployment rate. It's the one that would be the headline on the Wall Street Journal when it goes up or down. Anyway, the one that is, now the word broad here means includes the most people. So just bear that in mind, broadest. So I'll make a little note here, i.e. it includes most people. So in other words, and U6 is the one where essentially almost anybody gets counted. Even if you've made even a trivial effort to look for work anytime in the past, you're probably going to get counted at least in U6 as unemployed, I mean. All right, now frictional unemployment means this refers to people who are temporarily, and that's the magic word here, between jobs. Okay, in other words, you are a recent college grad. It might take a few months to get that first job. While you're looking, you're considered to be frictionally unemployed because it's really only realistically only a matter of time before you find that first job. The problem isn't the economy, not necessarily. The problem isn't your lack of skills, because you certainly have skills. You're a college graduate, but it does take time to find that first job. So the labor markets are relatively inefficient compared to many other markets because it's harder to match up people with jobs than, let's say, you go to a market where they're selling goods and services like a retail store. The stores have to figure out what people want to buy, but if they're able to do that properly, it doesn't take that long to get merchandise to the people who want it. Jobs, though, choosing somebody for a job is tricky business. The employers are always worried that they're going to pick the wrong people. Okay. And, it's even in the United States, you can get rid of people fairly easily, but it's not that easy. You do have to have a valid reason to get rid of people, even in the United States. Obviously, in France, as they said in the videos, hiring a worker is like going on a blind date where you must marry the person, because you're basically stuck with them forever. So frictional, you see a ton of that in France, and not so much here. And structural, now this refers to people who are unemployed because of poor job skills. I mean, I guess we can just leave it like that. That covers a lot of territory. In other words, that covers things like you have a skill that's no longer in demand. You don't have a good skill set. Maybe you are a high school dropout and nobody wants to hire you. Maybe you have been in jail and nobody wants to hire you. Or, there's a lot of reasons why employers might shy away from you. But the idea here is that it is not because of the economy. It's because of your own lack of marketable skills. And so these are the people who need training. Okay, that's really what will help them. Not so much lowering interest rates, but providing them with jobs and training. Okay, and it does exist. They do have it. There are provisions every year in, I don't know exactly how it works, but especially for jobs that have been eliminated due to international trade, there do exist funding, sources of funding available to help people find new jobs. But while they're still training, they're considered to be structurally unemployed. And then finally, cyclical unemployment. This refers to people who are unemployed due to state of the business cycle. That's where the word cyclical comes from, the business cycle. Okay, in other words, if the economy slows down, some people might lose their jobs. They're considered to be cyclically unemployed. Those are the ones who would benefit from things like more government spending, tax cuts, lower interest rates, that type of thing, which we'll be seeing a lot more of later in the course. And then finally, the natural rate of unemployment. This is the rate of unemployment that would exist if there were no cyclical unemployment. Okay, so when cyclical unemployment goes down to zero, what's left is all frictional and structural. The sum of those two is what we mean by the natural rate of unemployment. And I'm not sure why they call it the natural rate. I mean, essentially what it's saying here is that this is as low as it can go without something else changing. Like, you can't get rid of frictional unemployment unless you somehow increase the efficiency of labor markets. You can't get rid of structural unemployment without providing training to these people. It's the cyclical part that policymakers can theoretically reduce by changing, like I said, interest rates or government policies like taxes and spending. All right, so that's it for this problem set. So now we're ready to take a peek at chapter 7, our discussion about Fernando. Yes.
There's a question in the chat. Someone asked, like, what would you define a seasonal worker as? And
Oh, that's a very good question, because some jobs are definitely seasonal, like farming, for example. Clearly, farms need more workers during the summer than the winter. So I don't know the exact way that BLS defines seasonal workers. We could probably look it up if you need to know the exact details. But yes, obviously people who are seasonal are considered to be unemployed while they're waiting to go back. In other words, they're not considered to have dropped out of the labor force, because we know that they're going back as soon as the season changes. Let's just check this out for a second. Devin?
Yeah, so since they're like not going back, isn't that like a temporal thing?
It is. It all depends on how soon you're likely to go back to work. In other words, this is different because this is a regular thing. It happens every year. And it's like, like if you look at retail stores, they hire a lot of extra people at Christmas time.
Yeah.
And, so clearly that kind of employment is seasonal. But I don't know if that might be a little different, because the season is just, 1 or 2 months. So let's see what they've got here. The levels of employment and other measures undergo fluctuations due to seasonal events, including things like weather, harvest, holidays, school schedules. Because they follow a regular pattern every year, their influence on statistical trends is eliminated by seasonally adjusting. All right, this is not exactly what we were looking for. Joe?
Yeah, I just asked because over the summer I work during the 3 months from July, June, August, and then
Right.
during the year I'm here obviously, so I'm not working.
Right. I think that while you're in, or are you working full time during the summer?
Yeah.
So here's what's going to happen. During that period, you'll be considered fully employed. And then when you go back to school, you're no longer part of the labor force because you're in school. So you're not going to be counted as unemployed, but just simply not part of the labor force. Now, the unemployment, by the way, this is actually an interesting topic here. The numbers that we're looking at, unemployment, inflation, and all the rest, GDP especially, the government knows that the seasons can affect a lot of these numbers. And so what they will do is they'll say, listen, we know that employment will go up and down during the different seasons. We're interested mainly in long-term trends. Is there growth in employment? Is there not? So what they will do is they will take the original data, and what they'll do is they'll make adjustments for the time of the year to get a better feel for, is unemployment rising or falling? And we call that a seasonal adjustment. And Deveray?
Yeah, I was gonna ask the same question because I worked at camp the whole summer, and I
Right.
come back to school, and then I was like wondering, because when I get my checks, obviously we get Social Security and
Right.
taxes
That's right.
taken out, and
Yes.
I always wondered why I never got as much taxes out as other people. But then someone told me it's because I was still a dependent of like my mom. Or
That's
like
part of
my
it.
parents.
That is definitely part of it. But also because when they figure out your taxes, they're trying to anticipate how much you're going to earn for the entire year. And they know that you're working at a seasonal position, which means that your total earnings for the year are not going to be, let's say, 12 times what you earn every month during the summer. So that's why they don't hold as much back, because they know that you're going to be in school the rest of the year. And so the tax is supposed to be based on what they think you're going to earn over an entire year. So when you have a lot of money for short periods of time, they will probably lower the amount of taxes they withhold just because they know that you're seasonal. Now, the Social Security is different. It's always a fixed percentage. That never changes. It's X percent regardless of your circumstances. And that'll continue for the rest of your life. But when you get to that age, they'll just start collecting checks, and you'll be very happy that they did that. But that's what it's for, to give you some income when you retire, in addition to your lifetime savings. But the tax part, most likely you'll get a refund anyway. I mean, if it was just the summer, you'll probably get it all back, except for the Social Security, and Medicare too. That's for when you're older and you need medical insurance. So, but yes, but as far as the numbers go, you might remember every time we looked at Fred, let's go back to Fred for a second. Let's look at GDP. And if you look at the series that they're offering us, there it is. Now, if you look right here, these are the magic words: seasonally adjusted. What that means is that they took the actual numbers, and what they said was, listen, how much of this was due to the season only? And what they do is they either raise the number or they lower it to offset the effect of the season, so that what you're seeing here is the growth of GDP independent of the season. Okay, so we can also look at not seasonally adjusted data. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so not seasonally adjusted. Oh, I grabbed the wrong one. Would be the actual numbers. And so you almost always have the option of looking at seasonally adjusted or non-seasonally adjusted. And essentially, again, what it is the non-seasonally adjusted is the actual data. Seasonally adjusted means they make little changes. For example, they know that the economy is going to be stronger in December because of Christmas. And so they make little adjustments so that what you're seeing is the data that would exist without the season, because sometimes it can be very deceiving. And so almost all these numbers are frequently adjusted for the season. And so you have to know when you're looking for these numbers, if you're looking for seasonal or non-seasonally adjusted data. It depends on what you want to know, but it's all available. You just have to keep your eye on that. Do you need seasonally adjusted data or not? And so you can have it either way, but the seasonal adjustment takes into account the fact that within the same calendar year, unemployment, GDP, et cetera, can be affected by the seasons. And like you were saying, a lot of students work during the summer and they know that. And so, in order to avoid giving the impression that unemployment is falling dramatically just because it's the summer, they correct for that so that the actual unemployment rate, which is independent of the season, is what we're seeing. All right. Well, anyway, so let's get back to inflation. So inflation, as you know, means that the value of the dollar is decreasing over time. In other words, things become more expensive over time. Now, you probably have heard stories from, let's say, your parents or grandparents about how cheap things used to be compared to now. And that's true up to a point, because prices do tend to rise. Okay. So, for example, I know from my own personal experience that there was a time when gas was about 35 cents a gallon. It's hard to imagine now. That was a long time ago, though. Prices do tend to go up over time. Now, does that mean our standards of living are going down? Not necessarily. Okay. So many economic data series are adjusted for inflation, like we saw last week with GDP, or whenever it was, we were adjusting GDP for inflation and coming up with a number called real GDP. So nominal GDP is the actual data that you're looking at from the real world in that year. Real GDP is that data adjusted for inflation. So many economic series are adjusted for inflation, and they're then called real, like, for example, real interest rates or real GDP, because they want to correct for the fact that the dollar gets weaker over time, or I guess I should say the purchasing power goes down. And so now what we want to understand is, how is inflation measured? And why does it happen in the first place? And is it good or bad? Okay, so we'll start by considering an index called the CPI, or Consumer Price Index. Now, this is going to prove to be one of the most important measures of inflation because it directly affects or measures the cost of living for individual consumers. There are other measures of inflation that include other things like the cost of producing new products by businesses, where they would include things that you would not include in CPI. For example, the price of crude oil. That doesn't get counted in our CPI because people don't buy it directly. They buy gasoline, which has been refined. So there's multiple measures of inflation, but this is the most popular one, the CPI, again, because it refers directly to the cost of living for consumers. So formally, the CPI, what they actually do, and it's hard to imagine they have time to do this, but they create what they call a basket. And by the way, this is also the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They keep track of unemployment data, and they also keep track of inflation data. And what they do is they create what they call a basket of goods, which is meant to represent what do people typically buy during a given year. And they're basing this on the assumption that we are shopping for what we will call a typical urban family of four, however that is defined. So imagine yourselves being that typical urban family of four. Let's say you live in Manhattan and you have your parents and one sibling, and it's just the four of you who live there. The basket that these people create consists of all the goods that you might buy during the given year. And they use that basket to determine how much the cost of living is changing. So if the cost of that basket goes up by 5%, for example, during, let's say, the year 2021, that means inflation in 2021 was 5%. That's how they do it. All right. So they're trying to capture how much more it costs every year to buy that same basket. All right. Now, you can imagine this is quite a challenge. Can you imagine all the different goods and services that you might buy during a typical year? It's a huge list, but they have to do it. And in fact, I think I have here somewhere on my hard drive. I downloaded once. Let's see if it's still here. Let's see. I hope I can find it. There it is. Wait, no, that might not be it. Oh yeah, this is it. So what exactly are we seeing here? So the way they do this is they create that basket, like I said, but they also scale the numbers in an important way. What do I mean by that? If you notice, all these numbers are in the 100s or 200s. What they've done is they've taken the price of the basket. Let's say the basket costs $8,000. Okay. What they do is they set or choose what's called a base year. And in this year time, the base year happens to be the range between 1982 and 1984. And so let's go back to that year right about here. And what they do is they set that time frame, it's right about here, equal to 100. So that way, every year after that, these numbers reflect how much prices have gone up since the base year. So for example, in January of 2021, the CPI is 261.582, which means prices are about 2.6 times what they were in the base year of 1984. Okay, 2.6 times. Or think of it as having gone up by about 161%. Okay, so that's why these numbers look this way. They're meant to represent the increase in prices since the base year. But the actual composition of this index is very, very complicated. In fact, I think that's what this document is. Yeah, so this is going back to December. No, here it is. We got. Oh, okay. See, what they're trying to do here is say, listen, all items count as 100%. So here's the categories that they're looking at. Like, for example, we have food, which accounts for about 14.19 or 19% of the basket. Energy, about 6.15%. Everything else, about 79.26%, which includes things like apparel and vehicles, services, medical care, rent. All these different categories fall into this category. Now, these are the percentages. These are not the actual values. They're telling you here how much they assume you're spending on these different items. So in other words, the typical urban family of four is spending roughly 14.119% of their money on food every year. And so this, when you take these numbers, these relative importance, which are called weights, you multiply them by the actual cost of buying these products, and you end up with the cost of the basket for that year. And then you adjust it so that we know how much it's changed since the base year. So right here, like I said, the basket, whatever the actual cost is about 2.6 times what it was in the base year. And that way we know how much prices have gone up since 1984. All right. So now we can also compare two different years. For example, here's January 2020. And here's January 2021. So what I'm going to do is calculate the percentage change between those 2 years. That would be the January 21 number minus the January 20 number over the January 20 number. And so that's approximately 1.4%, which means the inflation rate from the beginning of January 2020 to 2021 is about 1.4%. That's how much inflation was during that year. Now, we don't know what it'll be this year, but you can calculate it by finding the number for January 22 and calculating the percentage change compared to January 21. Okay. So that's our brief look at how CPI is calculated. And so now you have a sense of what's going on with the CPI. And if you want to look up these numbers, they're right here. So according to this, the CPI went up 0.3% in August. And you notice these numbers are always a little bit behind. It takes them a while to gather up this information. And you'll notice, if you look at the increase in prices, most of it came from energy. All right. And so they break it up for you this way. The reason why they do it with food and energy is because they represent a large percentage of our budgets, but also because they tend to change the most from one year to the next. They can change quite a bit, even if prices are stable in the rest of the economy. So this number, all items less food and energy, is often the one that we pay the closest attention to, because these two tend to bounce around so much that it makes it harder to tell if we're really experiencing more or less inflation. Oh, and here we go. CPI went up 5.3% over last year. So in other words, from August of 20 to 21, CPI went up about 5.3%. And that means the inflation rate is about 5.3%, which is quite high by recent standards. US inflation has been hovering around 2 to 3% for about the last 30 or 40 years. So this is actually a significant amount for the United States. Now, there are many countries in the world where the inflation rate is quite a bit higher. We have one of the lower inflation rates, although the champion for low inflation right now has to be Japan. Their inflation rate has been zero or very close to it for at least 30, 40 years. So why don't we see if we can find a chart. And I think we did this once before, didn't we? This is not what I want. I wanted it sorted. For some reason, it's not sorted. Oh, no, that's not what I want. All right, well, here's alphabetical. Let's see if we can find some countries that are unusually low or high. Um, Oh, Ecuador. Now, this is negative 0.3. That means their prices are actually falling. They're experiencing something called deflation. So is El Salvador for some reason. Let's see. Estonia too. Ethiopia, 15.8%. That's very high. Fernando?
Yeah, when you mentioned about deflation, I earlier in the chart what we were looking, I think it was the CPI. It said about like when prices fall, it's known as deflation,
That's correct.
and also said like debts become like more expensive. And I wanted to ask why would that
Yes.
affect the dollar
Okay, well,
scale?
let's think about it this way. This is exactly why deflation is a real problem. So what's happening here is this. Now, I'll give you an example from the Depression. All right, because this is when we really saw this happening. During the Depression, many farmers went out of business due to deflation. Now, in order to get into farming, you have to borrow a lot of money to buy land, equipment, crops, seeds for the crops and all this and that. Farmers typically have a great deal of debt to finance their land, equipment, etc. So imagine this situation. Suppose a farmer is paying, I don't know, let's say $1,000 a month to repay his loans. He sells wheat for $10 a bushel. The price then falls to $8 a bushel. So why is this a problem for the farmer?
Probably because of since when he's selling it, he was initially selling it for $10. Now the price falling down to 8, won't be able to like make more product as it initially thought it was, I believe.
Well, here's the thing. Let's say the amount of wheat he can sell is the same, whatever it is, 1,000 bushels a week or whatever. The problem here is that his revenues are going down, but are his expenses going down? Does he have to still pay $1,000 a month? Yes, he owes that money. He's got to pay it back. So he's paying $1,000 a month, but the revenues from his wheat are going down. And eventually the price falls enough, he won't have enough money to pay his debts and he goes bankrupt. And this is what happened. So there's the rub, because your expenses are not changing, but your revenues are falling. And so anybody who owes money is in the same boat. Or imagine you're a homeowner and you have a mortgage and your salary starts to fall because of deflation. Can you continue to make your mortgage payments? Probably not. So you can see deflation is, well, it sounds like a wonderful idea. Prices falling. Wow, who would have complained about that? But it tends to be very hard on people who owe money, which is essentially everyone. When you think about it, people who own houses, people who are running businesses, very few people don't have any debt. And so anyone who has debt is going to be hammered by this, or, I mean, come on, in the recession, the depression, the deflation rate was something preposterous, like 10, 15% a year. Even a trivial amount of deflation, though, can be harmful to people who owe money. So the Federal Reserve System has a policy of trying to avoid deflation. They would rather have a little bit of positive inflation than deflation. That's one of their explicit policy goals, to avoid deflation. Because as far as they're concerned, it could potentially be more harmful than a small amount of positive inflation. And in fact, their feeling is that a small amount of positive inflation is needed to enable the economy to grow, because, in order to produce more goods and services, you need to hire more resources. And when you do that, prices tend to rise. So to a certain degree, rising prices can actually be a sign of a healthy economy that's growing. and strong and doing very well. But deflation is going to always bear the hardest on debtors, which realistically is the vast majority of people and businesses. And so that's why it is actually in some ways worse than inflation. So the idea here is to keep a nice balance. So the Federal Reserve's target is 2% inflation. They don't want it to go above that, but they don't want it to go below that either, because then we could start running into this situation where we suddenly find ourselves with deflation. On the other hand, positive inflation is not necessarily good either once it gets above 2% or so, because then what they found from past experience is that once inflation starts rising, everybody starts raising their prices because they expect more inflation. And before you know it, inflation takes on a life of its own, and it can really get out of hand very quickly. And in fact, we're going to see some videos where exactly that happened in some of these countries. So inflation is kind of like something you have to keep it under control. You do not want to let it get out of control quickly because it is very hard to stop it. It's almost like letting a lion out of a cage. Once he's out of the cage, it's going to be very hard to catch him. All right. Or some people have compared to rolling a boulder down a hill. As it gets further down the hill, it's going to become harder and harder to stop it. But anyway, so yes, this is why deflation is a real issue too. And some of these countries are experiencing it, as we saw on this chart. But the big one is Japan's. Japan is always right on the verge, right on the brink. Let's see where they are now. They're 0. Okay, they're right there. They're always right on the edge. Now, this surprises me, Italy, because traditionally Italy has had a lot more inflation than most Western European countries. I don't know what's going on over there. I have to look into that. Look at Lebanon, eating at 4.9. Oh my God. Yeah, when a country's starting getting up in that neighborhood, that's a problem. Oh my God. Let's see, who else do we have? Sudan, Spain is, oh my God, Spain too. This surprises me to no end because Spain traditionally had somewhat higher inflation than the other Western European countries. Sweden is pretty low. Turkey, 12.3, that's good. They used to have much higher inflation. United States at this point was at 1.2. That was probably recorded during the height of the COVID, though, because when the COVID was around, there's a lot less economic activity, and you would expect to see less inflation than what you normally get. In fact, that might be why some of these Western European countries have such low inflation rates, because they were locked down. This is not really normal data then. So maybe, at some point, maybe we'll look at some older data to see what used to be normal. But yeah, it's pretty low here. I suspect that the COVID has a lot to do with this. But anyway, let's see now. So the CPI is one of the more popular measures of inflation, and there's different kinds of CPIs, by the way. There's one that's meant for only urban households. There's one for each region of the country. They break it up in some cases to wages versus blue collar versus white collar, that type of thing. So there's a bunch of them, just like there's different unemployment rates. But the one that we hear about in the press is the CPI-U, which means the urban family of 4. And so we use that as a measure of inflation. And the market basket, as we started to discuss, that they use to measure CPI consists of several major categories. But again, they're trying to capture what kinds of things you normally buy in a normal year, food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical services, recreation, education, and communication. Now look at this. Look at how much work this is going to be. 211 categories from 38 different geographical regions. Altogether, they have to go out and record 8,018 different values. And they have to do this every month too. That's going to take a lot of time, as you can imagine. And the weights that we saw earlier depend on what proportion of our incomes are spent on these different items, which we saw in this chart. Like we said, food is 14.119%. Those are the so-called weights. And you can see they break it down much further than that. Cereals and bakery products, meats, poultry, fish and eggs, et cetera, et cetera. Food away from home would be restaurants or fast food places. Pretty big percentage, I must say. So they have quite a task, quite a hard task, quite a hard job to do here. But, you know, it's really considered to be the most reliable information we have about inflation. And as we said before, the goods that we're calculating can be based on current prices or the base year prices, where the base year is an arbitrary starting point. Now, the reason why it's an entire range of years is because prices were really, really stable during this period. So that whole area or a block of time is considered to be the base year. So in other words, when you look at the CPI now, what you're seeing is how much prices have changed since this base year period. The base year doesn't get changed very often. But you can see that as we get further and further away from the base year, one of the real issues with the CPI is that the baskets themselves are not adjusted all that frequently, and they may not reflect our current spending patterns as well as they should. This is especially a problem with newly invented products that didn't exist when the basket was first created. So there's a lot of potential issues with the CPI, just like GDP. In fact, there's no economic data series that has no problems at all. They all have issues. Okay, so, but the BLS is a very reliable source of this data, and we can consider what they do to be very, very accurate. So anyway, so given how late it's getting, I do want to make sure we see at least one or two of these videos, and because they're very, very interesting and very insightful. And oh, before we start watching these, don't forget what we're going to do on Friday, which is to look at the sample midterm. So let's get this going here. Hold on. I seem to have lost my place here. This happens to me all the time. I open up all this stuff, and before you know it, I'm not able to find Moodle here. All right, you know what? Oh no, maybe it's over here, I guess. Yeah, because that's where the links are. So we have there it is. We might as well start. This makes the most logical sense. What is inflation? All right, we're going to formally define what inflation actually is.
Friends would watch.
Up. Okay, so let me send you the link. And let's get started.
Walk up to me and just be like, "What the f is in your mug?" And I would just tell them, "It's mud."
Income, but in the longer term, raising demand keeps rising. Incomes and prices in the past were amazingly different from what they are today. In Pride and Prejudice, one of the oddest things about economic life is that the prices for things keeps rising. Incomes and prices in the past were amazingly different from what they are today. In Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Darcy is supposed to have been one of the richest people in Britain. It's 1813, and his income is £10,000 a year. Today, that's less than half of what a primary school teacher straight out of college would earn. In Sense and Sensibility, there's an argument about whether an income of £20 a week is enough to make you well off, and the answer is yes. It's there in living memory too. A cinema ticket was 30p in 1970. Today, it's £13. So why does inflation happen? And should we worry if it does? Governments track inflation obsessively. and try to keep it low. There's a vast amount of data collected all the time to ensure that governments can say with amazing precision how the inflation rate is going. Is it on track for 2.3% per annum, or might the increase of 0.38% in February be a cause for alarm? This is, in big historical terms, a relatively new concern. In the 17th century, the Spanish Empire essentially collapsed from inflation without even realizing it was occurring. So, over time, societies have become obsessed with measuring inflation and very focused on managing it. So, why is there inflation? What makes it happen? There are basically three reasons. The first is what economists call cost-push inflation. This is where the costs to businesses rise and are then passed on to customers. There can be a lot of reasons for these rises. Firstly, raw materials, especially oil, might get more expensive for a very nice reason, because a lot of countries are developing and doing well. Secondly, workers might be asking for more money and succeeding either because they've organized themselves well politically or because schools and colleges haven't been training enough workers in the skills that companies need. Thirdly, land rents might be increasing because not enough factories and offices have been built, which tends to come down to political failures around building permits. The result of all this is that businesses then push their extra costs onto the consumer by raising prices. They don't want to, it's a scary move, but they have no choice. They'd go out of business otherwise. The second kind of inflation is called demand inflation. This is when there are increases in the number of people who want something whose supply can't keep up. The most common cause of demand inflation is an otherwise rather nice thing, that people are getting richer and have more money to spend. That's why government can cause inflation by lowering taxes. Everyone loves tax breaks because they raise disposable income, but in the longer term, raising demand can also cause price rises, thereby negating some of the initial boost of the tax break. Similarly, a fall in interest rates may cause short-term pleasure and long-term inflationary pressure. If interest rates on loans or mortgages fall, we might be tempted to take out a loan to buy the new car we've always wanted. But the car company, sensing solid demand, will soon enough jack up the price. If banks and governments inject more cash and credit into the economy, people have more money to spend. But if they're all chasing the same number of goods as before, it just means they can all offer more for the same. This is what happened around housing in the UK, particularly in London. There are broadly the same number of houses there were 25 years ago, but they all cost an absurd amount more. The third classic cause of inflation is governments printing money. There's a deep logic behind this idea, which can at first sound almost criminal. Governments often want to stimulate the economy to create more jobs, so they print more money. This can be done literally by increasing the number of notes in circulation, or they can do it by increasing government debt or by letting banks make bigger loans on the same security. In all these cases, the amount of money in circulation increases. But there's a big problem, because after a while, it means the worth of every note starts to fall, because more notes are chasing the same number of things to buy. There's more money about, but it doesn't buy you more, it just pushes up prices. However, there is a possibility here, spotted by the economist and philosopher John Maynard Keynes. It takes time for the value of money to fall. So, for a little while, there can be more cash around and prices haven't yet risen. This is a window of opportunity that economies can, with a lot of luck, seize. At such Goldilocks moments, people can actually increase their consumption. Firms can afford to hire more workers and buy new machinery. And once they've done that, production will increase. There will be more stuff to buy before inflation has eaten up the gain. So there's a real expansion. A bit of inflation can grow the economy. That's a big but contested idea. The argument is that it doesn't matter if prices are going up 10% every year, if wages are going up 15%. So deliberate government-led inflation can be a mechanism for growing the economy. But it's a very risky move, which has often backfired and been attacked by the great enemies of the Keynesian economists, people we now know as the monetarists, who believe that anything which increases inflation is always going to be an issue and must be avoided at all costs, whatever the short term. So why is inflation such a problem? The real problem is that not everything inflates at exactly the same rate. If everything went up by 100% a year, and so did everyone's income, and it was all totally steady and predictable, it would be weird, but it wouldn't actually do any harm. The harm comes from the fact that not everything changes at the same rate. In 1941 in Hungary, inflation reached 150,000% each day. A jelly bean that cost 10p on Monday morning would therefore cost the equivalent of £150 on Tuesday morning and £225,000 on Wednesday morning. That's incredibly complicated, but it's a problem only because other things would not be increasing as fast. If you kept your life savings under the mattress, you'd be wiped out in a day or two. The money that could have bought you a house on Monday would get you a jelly bean on Wednesday. This is the ultra extreme case, but it illustrates a basic point. Inflation is bad for savings. There's no point in putting money aside, and that's a pity, because saving money, the attitude of saving up for things before you buy them, is an admirable characteristic. Keeping inflation low rewards prudence. It helps long-term planning, because you can know what your money will be worth in the future, and this rewards taking care around costs. Ultimately, what inflation reflects is the instability of the world and of life itself. Prices rise because we can't yet keep the complex system known as the economy under control. There's always something going wrong or growing or falling or failing somewhere. Ideally, we'd keep inflation under control with a more or less fixed amount of money chasing a more or less stable amount of goods. But in reality, low inflation is extremely difficult to achieve because so many factors can derail it. Cost of materials, cost of labor, productivity, taxes falling or rising, exchange rates, again, falling or rising, a growing domestic economy, a neighboring economy that's growing, falling interest rates, the buying of government bonds, or the printing of money. In the end, we may have to accept that inflation is a bit like the weather or our own moods, something that's inherently rather unstable, something whose ups and downs we must endure even as we try to mitigate the extremes. Learning to live with inflation belongs to wisdom.
Looking for a new heating or cooling?
Well, how was that? I thought that was very well done. I mean, they really talked about a lot of the important issues of where's inflation coming from, what causes it, why is it such a problem? And he raised a lot of interesting points, like the idea that inflation is a problem because not all prices rise at the same time, including wages. And of course, as inflation starts to rise, it can get out of hand very quickly. That case of Hungary in World War II, that is still the all-time record, by the way. But it puts it in quite a bit of perspective when you see how much prices were going up, 150,000% a day. That's beyond belief. So we're going to see in one of the later videos how and why this can actually happen. And there's been a more recent experience with this in Zimbabwe about 13 years ago, where their inflation rate was also quite large. But anyway, so the next one we want to look at is what gives a dollar bill its value? That's a pretty good question. And you can see now, we'll have to save this for another day, but in Zimbabwe's recent bout with hyperinflation is something that we want to study as well, because it helps us understand how this can happen and how it can be avoided in the future. All right, but let's look at this one next. What gives a dollar bill its value? You're probably wondering that yourselves. Why do we accept dollar bills in exchange for our labor or goods and services that we produced? They're just pieces of paper. What is that all about? All right, let's find out. All right, there we go.
If you tried to pay for something with a piece of paper, you might run into some trouble. Unless, of course, the piece of paper was a $100 bill. But what is it that makes that bill so much more interesting and valuable than other pieces of paper? After all, there's not much you can do with it. You can't eat it. You can't build things with it, and burning it is actually illegal. So what's the big deal? Of course, you probably know the answer. A $100 bill is printed by the government and designated as official currency, while other pieces of paper are not. But that's just what makes them legal. What makes a $100 bill valuable, on the other hand, is how many or few of them are around. Throughout history, most currency, including the US dollar, was linked to valuable commodities, and the amount of it in circulation depended on a government's gold or silver reserves. But after the US abolished the system in 1971, the dollar became what is known as fiat money, meaning not linked to any external resource, but relying instead solely on government policy to decide how much currency to print. So which branch of our government sets this policy? The executive, the legislative, or the judicial? The surprising answer is none of the above. In fact, monetary policy is set by an independent Federal Reserve System, or the Fed, made up of 12 regional banks in major cities around the country. Its Board of Governors, which is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, reports to Congress, and all of the Fed's profit goes into the US Treasury. But to keep the Fed from being influenced by the day-to-day vicissitudes of politics, it is not under the direct control of any branch of government. So why doesn't the Fed just decide to print infinite $100 bills to make everyone happy and rich? Well, because then the bills wouldn't be worth anything. Think about the purpose of currency, which is to be exchanged for goods and services. If the total amount of currency in circulation increases faster than the total value of goods and services in the economy, then each individual piece will be able to buy a smaller portion of those things than before. This is called inflation. On the other hand, if the money supply remains the same while more goods and services are produced, each dollar's value would increase in a process known as deflation. So which is worse? Too much inflation means that the money in your wallet today will be worth less tomorrow, making you want to spend it right away. So while this would stimulate business, it would also encourage overconsumption or hoarding commodities like food and fuel, raising their prices and leading to consumer shortages and even more inflation. But deflation would make people want to hold on to their money, and a decrease in consumer spending would reduce business profits, leading to more unemployment and a further decrease in spending, causing the economy to keep shrinking. So most economists believe that while too much of either is dangerous, a small, consistent amount of inflation is necessary to encourage economic growth. The Fed uses vast amount of economic data to determine how much currency should be in circulation, including previous rates of inflation, international trends, and the unemployment rate. Like in the story of Goldilocks, they need to get the numbers just right in order to stimulate growth and keep people employed without letting inflation reach disruptive levels. The Fed not only determines how much that paper in your wallet is worth, but also your chances of getting or keeping the job where you earn it.
I thought that video was very well explained.
I like that. Yeah. Because he's talking about the trade-offs between inflation and deflation, and the policymakers at the Fed have concluded that the best strategy is to keep inflation at a small but positive level to encourage consumption and spending, to stimulate businesses and production of consumer goods, without having so much inflation that we start to see prices rising like crazy, and then that ultimately becomes counterproductive. So having a small amount, positive amount of inflation is usually the best way to go. So yes, it's always so nice to see these with the video. You're seeing this happening right in front of you, and if the graphics are well done, I think it really makes a huge difference in understanding these concepts. And of course, the Fed itself is something we'll be studying a lot more of in later chapters, but the Fed is the one that decides how much money is in circulation. So they are indirectly determining the rate of inflation in the United States. So their job has been for all these years to keep inflation low, but not at zero. Okay, and so far they've done a pretty good job of it too. And of course, when there's a crisis in the economy, they often are the ones who have to bail out irresponsible companies and banks and things that have gone horribly wrong. They end up getting stuck having to clean up the mess. But primarily their job is to keep inflation at a steady but low level, steady enough to encourage growth, and also to avoid an increase in unemployment. All right, well, I think that was that was interesting. Now, there's many other videos that we have for this topic, just because it is such an important topic, and also because it ties together nicely with money itself, which is a topic that we'll be looking at in detail as we go along. So I think maybe for today that will be enough. But next time we're going to do the sample midterm, and if there's any time, we'll go back and start picking up again our discussion of chapter 7. And but I will make sure that each day we get to see some of these very cool videos, because I think it's extremely helpful in understanding what we're doing. And some of these videos are just amazingly well done. They're just, you just you'll see. I've got some others that you'll really find to be really interesting, because they're made by somebody who specializes in or who has a great intense knowledge of currencies throughout the world, and his videos are actually quite interesting. So anyway, for today though, I think we'll stop it right here, and we'll carry on Friday with the sample midterm, and then we can get back to our discussion about inflation. Okay. All right. And so in the meantime, I'll put the solutions to the chapter 6 problems on Moodle so you can look through them. But that's not on the midterm, so you don't have to worry about it. The midterm, remember, is just chapters 1 through 4. All right. Anybody last minute questions? All right. So see you all next time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.
See you later. Fernando?
Yes, Professor. Just wanted to talk back about the email that recently when I emailed you.
Oh,
Leaving the weekend. So after a class on Wednesday will be good, right?
yeah. Sometime during the afternoon. I don't know the exact time, but we'll figure it out tomorrow.
Yes, of course. All right. But
Okay. Sometime in the afternoon, most likely. I'm thinking more like 3-ish, something in that ballpark.
okay, sounds good.
So we'll figure it out.
All right. Thank you, Professor, for class.
Okay. All right.
Take care.
See you
Have a good day.
tomorrow. Okay. Bye.